Welcome to the second episode of the Who Is This Crazy Hag podcast. So, who am I? Well, I'm an army brat. Dad was a mechanical engineer and a Vietnam vet. We moved house every few years while I was growing up, and I went to a bunch of schools. I was always the new kid in town and learned to both fend off bullies and make new friends. When Dad left the army and built his house, he said we'd never have to move again, and I said, speak for yourself, because I had some big plans to see the world. Today, we're travelling to Syria. This story takes place in the mid-90s, about 30 years ago, when the world felt like it was a much easier place to live. If your ideal vacation includes lounging in hammocks and reading books, Secret Garden could be the perfect spot for you. From observing iguanas to watching hummingbirds, picking fresh tropical fruit from the garden, and walking to the beach, you can do as little or as much as you like. Secret Garden is an eco-house where you can get away from it all and truly relax. Make your booking on Instagram or Facebook at Secret Garden Mompiche. The links are in the show notes. Use the code WITCHPOD for a 20% discount on a 6-day stay. This story is from the book Few Ah Oo. We're probably going to hear roosters, barking dogs, maybe some birds, and whatever the hell the neighbours might be doing today. This story is called Thelma and Louise. Strap in, folks, it's going to be a doozy. As we trudged up the hill toward the Aleppo citadel, I had that eerie feeling you get when you know someone is watching you, even though you can't see them yet. I can feel it too, said Louise, squinting toward the ancient souks to see if she could spot our unseen observer. I shivered. The short hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I looked around but couldn't see anyone. The crowd was made up mostly of men in white robes. They all stared at us. 2 foreign women dressed in jeans and modest blouses. Everyone seemed to behave equally strangely. At first, I didn't notice the middle-aged man in the white robe and black keffiyeh. Okay, let's explain that, because the keffiyeh is the traditional headdress worn by men in the Middle East. You see them in black and red, and generally it's meant to provide protection from sunburn, dust and sand. So it's wrapped around their heads, often wrapped around their faces as well. He looked like everyone else sitting around sipping tea in the plaza near the souks. The souk we were in was the Al Madina souk, which is the largest covered market in the world and dates back to the 15th century. Unfortunately, it was damaged in the most recent Syrian conflict, but it was an absolutely spectacular place when we were there. As we explored the citadel, this creepy feeling didn't go away. We wandered around in the court, exploring the Byzantine cisterns and a few vaulted dungeons. We walked around the ramparts and took in the views of Aleppo spread out around us. The Byzantine era lasted about 1,100 years, beginning from the year 330 until 1453, when the Ottomans took over the region and it changed into the Ottoman era. It's still there, I told Louise, taking in my surroundings with an eagle eye. Still, I couldn't spot what was making me uncomfortable. Local and international tourists filed through the ruined fortress. Robed men sat in cafes and sipped traditional mint tea, smoking and chatting loudly. Nothing seemed out of order. After living in the Middle East for a while, I knew that men followed women all the time. Usually they never spoke or came close. They just followed and stood around ogling, sometimes muttering obscenities as women passed by. From time to time, violent incidents were reported. Often, women took the blame for these attacks, and many were forced to confess to being too open in their demeanour. They were punished. The men got off scot-free. Instinctively, I was certain someone had followed us, but I couldn't see who it was. "I think we're being followed around Aleppo," I said, simultaneously nervous and angry. "Keep your eyes and ears open," Louise said, "ready to do battle if necessary. I think I was followed back to our hotel from the souks yesterday." When I first arrived in Damascus, I wasn't entirely ignorant of the Muslim way of life. Intrigued by the fascinating region, its turbulent history, arid landscape, and its wonderful mix of peoples, I had read up on Syria to learn more. Conscious of being constantly observed, I always did my best to respect and comply with local customs and traditions. I always wore long-sleeved shirts with high necks and long dresses and pants. The only visible skin I ever displayed was on my face and hands. Even though I did not wear the hijab, I kept my hair covered with scarves on holidays, and I didn't look at men's faces in the streets. The hijab is a headscarf that conceals the hair and the neck, and sometimes the face. So when you see a woman in hijab, it's basically just the headscarf, often accompanied by a coat that's worn over the top of her normal clothing. In fact, I avoided looking directly at Syrian men altogether. At times, this simply was not enough. I loved Syria. I loved the Syrians. I loved the country and the people and the history and the culture. I loved the sights and the sounds and the smells. I loved the ruins and the landscape with its yellow wattle trees and tall gums and scrubby savanna. I loved that it looked a lot like Australia but wasn't. There were actually parts if you stood in the middle of it all and just closed your eyes and inhaled deeply, you might think you were sitting in the middle of a park in Sydney or somewhere in New South Wales. Just the smell of it was the same as home. However, I did not love the prospect of being harassed by scores of ignorant, depraved perverts every time I stepped out my front door alone. It made me feel paranoid about everyone who milled around the cobbled streets. It imparted too many negative feelings about what should have been a positive experience, living in Syria for a short part of my life. There were days the constant sexual harassment got to breaking point, where I was one lewd remark short of donning a black abaya. An abaya is a loose robe that covers the entire body from the shoulders to the feet. You see women in the Middle East wearing these all the time. They have clothing underneath them, but they have this very loose, very light fabric robe over the top of everything just to keep themselves hidden from the world. Still, I did my best to ignore the bad side of this life I had chosen and tried to get on with the good part. During the school break, Louise and I had travelled by bus up to Aleppo to visit the city and see our newest friends, Diane and Aisha, a couple we had met at a party in Damascus. The sandstone city of Aleppo was once a key town on the trade routes, including the Silk Road, for thousands of years. The ancient souks, khans, madrasas, courtyards and caravanserais were still in full use when we were there. The history and architecture was incredible. The city was absolutely beautiful. Our friends received us with warmth and generosity. During our 10-day stay in the centre of the ancient town, Louise and I wandered around the Ayyubid Palace and strolled through the magnificent gateway before visiting the Mosque of Abraham and the hammam nearby. A hammam is basically a steam bath or a bathhouse, and some of the hammams in Syria are over 1,000 years old. They're so elaborate and intricate and gorgeous. They're such elegant places, so we would visit a hammam every few days just to be in the steam, and it was just a fabulous experience. We ambled around the Umayyad Mosque through a stone-paved court with its ornate fountain situated right in the centre. After 2 days of touring around the city, I still had the heebie-jeebies. I can feel someone there, I said again, sounding like a broken record. You know when you have that feeling, there's eyes on the back of your neck, you know somebody's looking at you, but you can't see them? I had that. I had it for days, and I felt like I was going crazy, but I wasn't crazy. Aleppo is said to be the Syrian city that leaves the most profound impression upon its visitors. Never was a spoken word so true. As we came out into the daylight after strolling around the 12 winding kilometres of lanes and alleys in the covered souks, I saw the white-robed man again. I also recalled seeing him on the street as we walked toward the citadel, and he had been at the citadel as well. "Have you seen that guy before?" I asked Louise, discreetly pointing him out. "I don't know, maybe," she replied, not sure. It was that worn old cliché. They all looked the same. She looked hard at him, taking in his features. He slunk away around a nearby corner and down a narrow alley in the ancient labyrinthine souks, out of sight. I hadn't spotted him inside the market, but he had been there. I felt his ominous presence. A chill of fear travelled down my spine. He was stalking us. Unnerved, we walked around a different corner and marched straight back to our hotel. As we passed the cross street, he was there, just ahead, leering at us from a nearby juice stand. Once again, I pointed him out to Louise. "It's him. It's the same guy," I muttered, slowing down. "Don't look, just keep going," whispered Louise. Turning to me with a big smile, she looped her arm in mine. "Behave normally. Just pretend we haven't seen him." To look at the guy, you wouldn't think he was a pervert. He stood tall and proud in a commanding way. There was an elegant aura about him in the way he moved and stood. He didn't seem to be the stalker type. He seemed affluent. He was a little overweight, but only slightly, and his face and hands were dark. He wore expensive-looking Gucci shoes and a gold Rolex watch, possibly fake. It was hard to tell at a glance. On the third day of stalking us, his feline-like head was wrapped in a neat black and white keffiyeh and secured with an akal. The akal is like a double black cord that wraps around the top of the head that keeps the keffiyeh in place. You will see this in photos of men from the Middle East. His long white dishdasha was spotless. The dishdasha is the robe that men wear in the Middle East. You see this all the time. He looked well groomed. The disguise was completely inconspicuous. As we passed him in the street, I smelled the soap on his skin. We walked back to the hotel, both knowing he was there, not far behind us, but we didn't look around. Louise noticed he had gold rings on his fingers. His black eyes pierced holes into our backs as we forced ourselves to walk casually down the street. Neither of us wanted to change hotels. We liked our airy, cavernous rooms with huge bay windows. We loved the antique bathroom fittings, adored the wide flowing marble staircase, and revelled in the ornate lobby. The manager was indifferent when we told him we'd been followed. "What can I do?" he said, throwing his hands in the air with a shrug. It wasn't his problem. After some lengthy and frustrating discussion, he eventually assured us he would allow no strange men up to our rooms. In fact, he was adamant, with his brow deeply furrowed, that no men were permitted to climb the stairs to our rooms as long as we stayed under his roof. Resolute, we decided to stay where we were. A stalker wasn't going to scare us off. Besides, we reasoned, if we moved, he would probably find us again anyway. Our visits to Diane and Aisha's house for dinner almost every night would reveal our new location. The police were uninterested in our plight. "What do you expect?" they told us, laughing and making lewd faces at each other. "You are foreigners. You foreign women are all the same." Louise wanted to choke them and bang their heads against the stone walls. Maybe the lack of oxygen to their brains would increase their IQs. The constant sexual harassment from men on the streets, police, merchants, taxi drivers, and now this stalker was degrading and frustrating, humiliating, and mentally and physically exhausting. Our stalker stayed with us for 8 days. We concentrated on not freaking out. Our first mission each morning was to lose him in the crowd. Whenever we left the hotel, he was there waiting for us. Now that we had seen him, and he knew that we'd seen him, he made no effort to hide himself. Most days he sat in the driver's seat of a blue BMW across from the hotel. Each morning, as we came out for breakfast, he gestured for us to get in the car. One day, in halting English, he said he could give us a lift to wherever we were going. When we ignored him and rounded a corner, he got out of his car and followed us down the road. We ran away and lost him in the crowd, crossing the street toward the souk, and then doubled back through a little side street and spent a peaceful morning in the museum. When we returned to our hotel, he was standing outside near the door. He mumbled something as we passed. "What did you say?" demanded Louise in his native tongue. "Shame on you! How dare you follow us?" Her Arabic was perfect. She had understood every word. Saying nothing, he walked away, waving a hand back at us, laughing as he strode down the street as if nothing had happened. "What did he say?" I asked, a little curious, but not sure I really wanted to know. "Nothing especially bad," she said, exasperated. "Just that we are both beautiful. Still, it's sexual harassment. We don't need it." As a woman traveller around the world, I can tell you I've never been in a country yet where I wasn't somehow sexually harassed on a street. It didn't matter if I was in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, South America, all the continents I've set foot on, there's been men there very, very willing to make unsolicited, uninvited comments about me, my appearance, my body, and my life. Over the next few days, our stalker followed us to restaurants and cafes on what were meant to be relaxing walks around the fine city, to the gates of fine arts museums, to the bank where we changed money, and even to the bus station when we went to book our tickets back to Damascus. When we saw him outside Diane's house one night, just as we arrived for a party, we reported it to our friends. Several men ran out to the street looking for the stalker. They were armed with baseball bats, thinking to beat the life out of him, but he was gone. Eventually, Louise and I became fed up. Diane couldn't help any more than he already had. He worked long hours and didn't have time to chase around town for some anonymous creep who hadn't physically hurt us. Aisha was sympathetic but also felt powerless to assist. The authorities didn't want to know. We decided to take matters into our own hands. We had to do something to make him go away and put his potentially dangerous game at an end, so we made a plan. The following morning, on the last day of our vacation, we strolled out the door of our hotel in search of breakfast as usual. We had plans to travel back to Damascus later that afternoon, but still had to get through one more day in Aleppo with the threat of this persistent, still unpredictable stalker hanging over our heads. As expected, our robed nemesis was waiting for us. Arms linked for moral support and emotional strength as we strode towards his car, Louise and I looked at each other. Now we were committed to the plan. We had to stop this man not only from stalking and scaring us, but also from doing the same to other, more vulnerable women. There's nothing quite so frightening as having a strange man follow you around a city you're not familiar with. Who knows what he could do? Firm in our resolve, we stepped out into the street. As usual, he gestured at us to come over to his car. As usual, we looked the other way and walked around the corner. Louise counted to 3, and we heard the car door slam. Then another count to 5. Predictably, he was right behind us. Instead of running down the street and milling in the crowds, we stopped at a juice bar. In our experience, Syria's juice bars were among the world's best and not to be missed. Honestly, these places have every single kind of fruit you could possibly imagine and some you've never even heard of. They were the most fantastic places to go pick up a freshly squeezed juice first thing in the morning. Louise and I each ordered a large, freshly squeezed tropical fruit juice. Our living nightmare walked into the shop and ordered a fresh orange juice. My heart beat faster as I studied the floor and pretended not to see him. He scared me. His proximity made me want to run away screaming. Before my next heartbeat, I wasn't sure if I could go through with it. Standing 2 meters away from the man who had made my life hell for the last week gave me the creeps. He turned and smiled as we sipped the refreshing, cool liquid. Louise looked him in the eye. She was counting on him being as predictable as the sunrise each morning. The success of our plan depended on it. "What do you want?" she asked him in Arabic. "I want to show you my city," he replied. "We've seen it," she retorted sarcastically. "You know that. You've watched us walk all around it." "Not all of it," he retorted playfully, as if this were a great joke. "What can you show us that we haven't already seen?" she asked. Eyes narrowed. A little backstory on Louise. So she grew up in the military, much like me, except that her father taught her how to use weapons. She moved all over the world, and then when I met her in Istanbul, we together made a plan to go and teach in Damascus for a couple of months, just for the experience and because it's such an amazing city. During her childhood, she had learned Arabic, and when we were traveling around, her Arabic was impeccable. He was impressed. I couldn't believe she was so calm. I wanted to flee. For the first time in my life, I found the buckles on my handmade leather sandals absolutely fascinating. Louise turned to look at me. I saw her smiling gently in my peripheral vision. I inhaled deeply and looked up into her eyes. She looked surprisingly serene. Her relaxed expression calmed some of my jumping nerves. I took another sip of my drink and avoided his piercing gaze. "I can assure you, my dear, that Aleppo is filled with mysterious secrets," he replied with a toothy smile. This was her cue. Smirking, she studied his face for a moment. Her expression gradually changed from hardened cynic to softened sightseer. Watching her, I imagined Louise winning an Oscar for this brilliant performance. He smiled, lust flashing in his eyes. The juice bar owner polished the same spot on his shining marble bench for a full 5 minutes, peeping over neat piles of fresh fruit to satisfy his curiosity. I held my breath. Our fate was in her hands. If she decided to go ahead from here, we would have to be really careful. Things could easily go bad. We couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Whatever happened, I trusted her. "Okay," she said, nodding in acquiescence. "Show us your city." He was delighted. His name was Ikrit. Louise gave him fake names. I was so terrified that day, I don't recall what they were. "Where would you like to go first?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied, smiling. "You're the guide now. What would you like to show us?" We finished our delicious juice and handed the glasses back to the grinning vendor. With a sly smile, Ikrit paid for all of our drinks. Then we walked with him back to his car. Louise sat in the front passenger seat and I climbed nervously into the back seat. My heart pounded so hard I could barely think. As we pulled into traffic, he explained to Louise that he was a merchant and that he had wanted to speak to us since the first day he saw us at the Citadel. He unashamedly admitted to following us all over the city. He said he was just looking for a chance to talk to us. Of course, he hadn't been expecting us to send a mob of thugs out of our friend's house to beat him up with baseball bats. He just got away in time, he told her. Thrilled with our apparent surrender, he said he was interested in doing some trading in Europe, but didn't know anything about Europeans. He had many questions, except that he was targeting an Australian and a North American. He chatted with Louise in the front, delighted she spoke fluent Arabic, and ignored me in the back. She translated from time to time and threw a few sardonic comments of her own into the narrative. If I hadn't been so nervous, I would have laughed my head off. She told him the most outrageous lies, from our names to where we were from, what we did, and who we were. Lascivious Ykrit soaked it all up like a dry sponge plunged into a bucket of water. As we neared the edge of the inner city, Louise pointed at Lake Al-Assad on her map. "We've been wanting to visit this part of the country but haven't yet had the chance," she told him, behaving coyly. If I didn't know her better, I might assume that he had somehow charmed the knickers off her. He pawed at her legs as he drove. She shrugged him off, insisting he concentrate on driving. "We have all day to explore the lake," she coaxed, convincing him to keep his eyes on the road and his hands on the steering wheel. It wasn't part of our plan to be killed in a car crash. Ykrit was under the impression that we had moved to Aleppo and would be starting to teach English at a local school the following week. I was the last person planning to disabuse him of the notion. Our fake story was reasonably believable, and he devoured it. "The lake is a wonderful place to spend the day," he agreed. Happy to oblige two willing foreign women, and no doubt excited at the idea of a secluded spot to seduce us, he drove us out to the lake. We sped toward our destination, located halfway between Aleppo and Raqqa. Along the way, Ykrit stopped at a roadside stall to buy a large bag of fresh tropical fruit, some bag of nuts, and a few bottles of mineral water. "We might want something to eat later on," he explained with a big cheesy grin as he got back in the car. We arrived at the lake, and Ykrit quickly drove into a quiet, isolated area where there was lots of green grass and a thick stand of shady trees under which we could have our impromptu picnic. As the car rolled to a stop, I was terrified. My heart pounded in my ears. My role was simple. I only had one job. But if this didn't work, we could both end up dead. Or worse. "Come, come," he said, leaping out of the car, leaving the door open in his haste. "We can sit right here." He had left the keys in the ignition and the radio on. Arabic rock music blared from the speakers. Louise stepped out of the passenger seat and walked around to the back of the car. I climbed out of the back of the car and hovered near the driver's open door. I reached in to turn the volume down a little. Ykrit took no notice of me. Louise looked over her shoulder and winked cheekily. I nodded. I was as ready as I was ever going to be. Nervous, I held my breath. As Ykrit pulled a thick woolen blanket out of the trunk of his car, Louise pulled a gun on him. She'd borrowed a semi-automatic pistol from Diane's brother the night before, after explaining our crazy plan in detail to the small gathering of friends. They all nodded in agreement. "It's a good plan," they said, laughing at our unusual take on Syrian justice. "It's insane, but it's good." One of the boys had wanted to come with us to make sure our attacker would never strike again. We refused his offer. Killing the man, as much as we loathed him, wasn't on our agenda. That day, 7 people knew exactly where we were. Over the years, I heard from various friends and acquaintances that Louise was a crack shot. I hoped it was true. The look in Ykrit's face changed from glee to fear. For one long, breathless moment, he stared at Louise in disbelief. Anger flashed in his eyes like a struck match head, and then vanished. She ordered him to take off his clothes. Then, surprising me, the arrogant Syrian merchant smiled patronizingly at my friend. It's possible he was thinking this was just a funny foreign sex game. Maybe he imagined we do this all the time. It would seem so from what is frequently shown on the silver screen. Nevertheless, he played along willingly. Louise stood with her legs apart, both hands on the pistol, her hands as steady as a brain surgeon. She smiled, and her eyes said it was all a joke. Giggling, he removed his headgear and threw it on the ground. Louise instructed him to fold it neatly and put it in the trunk. Smiling indulgently, he did as he was told. As each piece of clothing came off, he folded it and tossed it in the trunk. Soon, Ikrit, the hungry, hairy Syrian merchant, was standing on the edge of the lake, wearing only his shining black Gucci's. She instructed him to take them off. He happily complied, going along with the game, tossing them into the trunk with a flourish, like a basketballer scoring a home game goal. He was obviously excited. Meanwhile, I sat in the driver's seat and watched events unfold in the side mirrors. I could see him, but not her. I thought he looked a little afraid, but wasn't taking the gun seriously. In his archaic culture, it was unthinkable a woman could dominate a man, or that one would even want to. The novelty temporarily amused him. Feeling angry at the stress he had caused us, I sat unmoving in the driver's seat, gradually turning the music down. When he was completely naked, Louise snapped the trunk shut and told him to get in the water. "But I can't swim," he protested, laughing. He took a step towards her, arms outstretched. He had an erection. Clearly, he thought it was time for the real game to begin. Louise took one step backwards and fired a shot near his feet. He cursed loudly and jumped to one side, away from the sizzling hole in the grass. I turned the engine over and gently pulled the car door closed. The music was still loud enough to cover the quiet rumble of the motor. I wound up the window. He didn't notice me at all. Right then, his eyes were glued to Louise and the gun. "Get in the lake," she growled, firing another shot over his head. Ikrit leapt into the clear blue water like a plump catfish, landing on his side. His head disappeared under the surface for a moment. His body bobbed like a washed-up buoy. He came up spluttering. "Go!" Louise yelled as she flung the door open and jumped into the passenger seat. We took off, burning rubber and spraying tiny stones behind us as I fishtailed towards the bitumen road. In the rearview mirror, I watched him splash clumsily out of the lake and run after the car, screaming and waving his fists. His erection had deflated. Naked and helpless, he wasn't the slightest bit threatening. A kilometre down the road, we started laughing. At the 5-kilometre mark, I had to pull over. "I don't believe we just did that," I gasped, shrieking with laughter. "The look on his face," Louise squealed, doubling over. We gathered the bits of ourselves back together and drove back into Aleppo. The first stop was our hotel. Louise retrieved Ikrit's clothing from the trunk and put them in a bag. Then we raced into her room and emptied it on the bed. Still giggling, her hands full of rumpled dish dasher, she rifled through his pants to find his wallet and discovered that he was carrying just over $1,000 in cash. We took it as partial compensation for a week of sexual harassment. "It's not nearly enough for the trauma and stress he caused us this week, but it will have to do," stated Louise, also pocketing his mobile phone. We went downstairs to pay our hotel bill. "You are checking out late. You will have to pay for the extra day," sighed the hotel manager, expecting an argument. "Fine, no problem," said Louise genially. Smiling, she peeled off a few more notes and handed them over. "Where are you going?" he asked, being polite. "We're off to Istanbul on the 4 o'clock bus," Louise told him, certain Ikrit would be back to seek revenge. We threw our bags into the trunk of the car, along with the bag of Ikrit's clothes, and drove over to Diane's house to return the pistol. He wasn't there, but Aisha was ecstatically relieved to see both of us unharmed. Still emotional, she phoned to report to Diane and his brother that we had returned safely. After we said our goodbyes, we drove the luxury car to a police station in the center of town and left it parked on the street right outside the front door with the keys in the ignition. We both felt sure Ikrit would have a lot of explaining to do when he got back into town. His punishment wasn't over by miles. Diane had noted down his license plate number for possible future reprisals. Just before we left, Louise playfully suggested it might be fun to stick around to see the look on his face if he saw us at the souks once more. I thought better of that. Instead, we jumped into a taxi and went to catch our bus. Half an hour later, our bags tucked under our seats, we were pulling out of the bus station and rolling towards Damascus. Louise looked over at me and grinned broadly. "Hey, Thelma, good job. Well done. Now let's go home, she laughed, flicking the old memory chip from her new cell phone into the seaside rubbish bin.
Hey there, love bugs! Welcome to the jungle! I'm Nancy Miarelli, your guide to the ecological and entomological, i.e. bug, wonders of Ecuador. With my master's in entomology and a passion for ecology and conservation, I'm here to take you on an unforgettable adventure through the mega diverse forests and more lush than you may have expected mountainsides of Ecuador. This year, I'm excited to offer 2 unique science-focused tours. Join me for a nature journaling course where we'll sit in the grass, sketch, observe, and reflect on all the creatures and plants that we discovered. Or dive deep into evolutionary theory on my evolution tour, where you'll see what you learned in a book that one time growing on the side of a tree. Ready to embark on a journey of discovery? Visit www.sybugs.info, that is Sybugs, SCIBUGS, to learn more or find me, Sybugs, everywhere on the internet. Let's explore Ecuador and all it has to offer together.
Just as a quick travel tip, guys, I do not recommend pointing guns at stupid men or stealing their cars. Well, I mean, technically we didn't steal the car, but I still think wiser travellers would avoid this type of lunacy. I'd also say don't get in cars with strangers, but since that's now a daily occurrence, it's kind of a moot point. In my defence back then, I was young, impressionable, and completely under Louise's magical spell. Just for your information, we are no longer friends. We lost touch many years ago. But her reckless energy was even more out of control than mine, and I don't think a partnership would have ended well at all. See you next week. Grab your coffee and get ready to hear what it's like to almost die in India. The Witch podcast is created, written, read, produced, edited, mixed and published by Ronnie. If you'd like to grab a copy of Few Are Oo, find the paperback on Amazon or email thewitchpod@gmail.com for an ebook. Also let us know via email if you're reading with a book club or a group of friends so we can give you a shout out. Don't forget to tell us where you are in the world. You can also visit The Witch Pod on Blue Sky, YouTube, Spotify and Substack.